Hi there, my name is Jason Gerson. I'm an intern at Google. And if you happen to have 25 to 30 minutes to learn more about this very insightful report by Charles Hurpy and Michael Kende, published by the Internet Society, I would be more than glad to walk through the details of the report with you. With that said, just to let you know, sort of the report itself focuses on annual exchange points, also known as IXPs, in Kenya as well as Nigeria. And with that said, we can go ahead and get started. Great. So just to get kind of talk about some of the kind of basic just terminology, there are two kinds of connections. You see the kind of top heading about what are IXPs, and we'll get to that in one moment. But just first, I kind of wanted to talk about what kinds of connectivities are there in the internet ecosystem. It's an important topic, and it kind of deserves being covered. So one is there are domestic sort of connections within a given country, of ways of getting data intended for internet usage from one provider to another. And so basically what that means is it means that you're using sort of a domestic pathway, almost think of like a highway, to get that data from one place to another within a given country. Maybe you're emailing someone else who lives in the same country, and that data is just going from one place to another. But the important thing is these are very modern, fairly inexpensive, fairly efficient ways of getting data around for domestic purposes. But there's also another means of getting data from one place to another, and that's international connections. They're really expensive. They're really less than ideal, but they do the job if the data really is going from one country to another country. But it really shouldn't be used for any purpose besides that because it's so expensive. Who would use it but for that purpose? So internet exchange points, now kind of returning to that top, help countries, internet service providers partner together to address traffic challenges and avoid tromboning. You see kind of these two ways of sort of two ways that data can kind of be handled via transit, and we'll sort of get to what the traffic challenges can look like in a moment. So tromboning. Tromboning is when one uses an international costly connection to get data from one place to another, when one could use a domestic connection, which would be cheaper. The only reason one wouldn't use the domestic connection is because maybe the service providers run out of domestic connections to use. Maybe the traffic is so bad in its domestic connections that it has to use an international connection to get that email out. So instead of using a domestic connection to get an email from you to someone who lives in the town next door, it instead is routing that data through an international connection, potentially outside the country, and then back to the person who was intended to receive that communication or that piece of data. So tromboning, and I couldn't tell you for the life of me why it's named after an instrument, but maybe it has something to do with the instrument's airflow, I'm not sure. But it causes cost, inefficiency, wasting international connections, and it really weighs down the internet ecosystem of a given country. And when you implement an IXP, what an IXP essentially is it's a warehouse for coordination for internet service providers. So basically what can happen is two internet service providers can say to one another, or multiple, in the case of an IXP, if there's many members, they can say to each other, if you have free internet connections that you aren't using for domestic internet connections, kind of think back to that picture. If you've got free lanes on your highway and I'm clogged up on my highway, I can sort of borrow a couple of lanes to send my data through. And a couple of weeks from now, if you're in the same position and your data is all clogged up on your domestic connection, and I've got free space, you can use my free space. And so what that does is, instead of kind of clogged domestic internet connections causing internet service providers to just jump over to using the international connections, even when it's for domestic data, they can instead partner with each other to really utilize the most free space possible to drive down costs and increase efficiency. So you'll see in the slide it talks about IXP, which is the IXP in Kenya. And with IXP, it was the first IXP. Now there are 2 in Kenya, and we'll be focusing really just on this one exclusively. The other one is in Mombasa. And when it originally opened, a telecommunications incumbent concocted some legal sort of maneuvers to pressure the IXP to sort of suspend operations, which it did eventually. It was later allowed, the IXP I'm referring to, was later allowed to reopen with an operating license, but was not allowed to reopen without that operating license. And it's the only government mandating operating license quite like it. Kenya is kind of sort of home to the only government mandated operating kind of license regime in the world. So it's quite interesting, and not fully with much real precedent. There's been another IXP that's opened since in Mombasa. So despite that sort of rough start, there's been noticeable progress. So latency and efficiency gains have really occurred, and those are sort of expected benefits of an IXP kind of textbook style. But there are some less obvious benefits. All of a sudden, students in the university system were using the internet in a more sort of kind of well-rounded way, in sort of a more thorough and intense way. Once they noticed that their internet connections were better, once the IXP was sort of beginning to impact how the ISPs operated. In fact, the Google installed a global cache, and once all this sort of started ramping up, and mitigated a lot of the cost increases that resulted from these students using the internet so much more for their university, because the university system had to pay the bills for this increased usage. In fact, if it weren't for Google's global cache, this increased usage of the internet by students, once they noticed that, goodness, the connection's so much better, once that occurred, it would have been, had it not been for the global cache, it would have resulted in $400,000 of additional cost for the university, but luckily that was mitigated through the Google global cache. But you notice many gains. You notice increases in performance. I'm referring to the column to the left. An estimated total savings of 1.5 approximately $1 million a year on international transit, increased revenues and mobile data traffic, more reliance on IXP as a way to increase revenues. And really something else quite interesting was you notice that all of a sudden domains were sort of, you saw trend lines change with domains. One example is that with Kende, which is sort of the domain sort of authority for .ke with Kenya's domain name, you notice that all of a sudden, once the internet quality started to improve due to the IXP, people were more willing to set up .ke websites. So all of a sudden, you really saw Kenya having its own sort of internet community independent of sort of the .com internet community, which is, you know, an exciting development. Sort of in addition to that, you see that IXP had kind of more sort of, as it sort of generated benefits for the internet at large, it sort of was able to attract kind of greater sort of infrastructural investment in general. And in addition, sort of one more thing to mention that wasn't on the slide mentioned specifically was that really you saw mobile banking sort of pick up significantly in Kenya with the IXP's establishment, because once sort of users had a good quality internet connection, it allowed mobile banking kind of to take off, because mobile banking really requires often, almost, you know, always a cloud sort of component, but the user would have to have a quality internet connection to kind of access that cloud component. So with that said, We'll now look at sort of dynamics, issues, and projections for IXP. It benchmarks well compared to its peers. It really, on all the metrics, it does better than its sort of comparable countries IXPs do. One thing to note is that really only 99% of the connections there in Kenya are mobile, which means that very, very, very few of them are on desktops or non-mobile sort of technological mechanisms. That's a kind of there's positive and sort of aspects to that, because the mobile sort of usage is very encouraging, but one cannot help but think that the most sort of intensive use of the internet often can occur on a desktop or a laptop, and unless sort of there's more sort of parity there, it might be difficult to see Kenyans really being able to use the internet in the fullest way possible. IXP adopts a usage fee model for its members, which is a very sort of in terms of sort of how to accrue funds and dues from their members for belonging to this warehouse of cooperation. And a usage fee model is really considered sort of the optimal way, or one of the optimal ways of collecting revenues through how the structure, the particular structure of organization that IXP is. And IXP is catalyzing on YouTube usage. You really have seen more videos being loaded in Kenya because of the increase in quality of internet. And you've really seen IXP propel Kenya into being really a regional hub. It's one of the top 15 IXPs, and it's really become quite successful as a regional hub. So sort of with all of that said, kind of open questions remain. Among them, can IXP remain effective despite sort of licensing issues? We mentioned that mandatory licensing regime. And how can IXP reduce uncertainty about which ISPs are really members? Because sometimes corporations in the past have expressed doubt in contracts as they sign contracts with ISPs, saying, we know that being a member of an IXP is quite important, so we'll only keep this contract, or we reserve the right to renege this contract, renege on this contract if we find out that you aren't really a member of the IXP. So why is there so much uncertainty in that regard, and what can be done to sort of address that? Here are the next steps. There's another content delivery network that's seeming to be kind of onboarded in Kenya, that would be modeled on the Google Global Cache that I mentioned earlier. Hopefully, and then kind of next steps will include more inter-ISP cooperation on cloud applications, and not just for sort of that mobile banking or proprietary usage. Bandwidth advantages, hopefully will assist Kenya becoming even more of a hub. But something important to note is that really all this growth is dependent on IXP, not just sort of being a warehouse, but being more than a warehouse. So, incorporating more data centers and really accruing more infrastructural sort of capabilities as a part of sort of its offerings in the internet space. Now we're going to kind of take another look at, instead of looking at Kenya, we're going to be looking at Nigeria. And in the case of Nigeria, there's a very interesting sort of story there. It was begun a few years later than Kenya's IXP. Nigeria's is known as IXPN. But something really worth noting is that Nigeria's performance is on track when its late start factor is considered. So as much as sort of Nigeria's IXP quality is sort of less impressive perhaps than Kenya's, it is kind of comparable once you factor into sort of that late start. One thing sort of they've got going for them, though, is that both authors of the report acknowledge that they've really got a very high quality governance structure. It's the same governance structure kind of running the IXP as an organization. How it's sort of run and organized is very comparable to the governance structure seen in the top kind of quality IXPs in the world. So And you've seen some real tangible effects. In the past, for instance, students would have to wait for traffic to take care of itself before seeing results for online, to complete online forms and for educational testing results in Africa's education, in the West African Examination Council's education systems testing results. So that had been an issue, and after the IXP kind of went online and you saw sort of improved quality and speed of the internet, all of a sudden students were able to access kind of that form for testing results in a quicker kind of load time and an easier sort of way than in the past. So another example is that EcoConnect is this linkage of various medical and educational stakeholders, basically various sort of medical colleges as well as other universities and colleges within sort of the educational system, all sort of linking to one another, and then linking their sort of pool of kind of internet resources to an IXPN connection. And that's sort of the sort of innovation you can kind of see in kind of data transit mechanisms. And you can see on the chart that they are quite significant. It's not as much. You notice that it's about $500,000 less in savings on international transit costs, but there are real gains. And you're also noticing that as sort of the IXPN helps internet service providers use the internet connections domestically more, there is less waste of the international connections, which is letting students and researchers in Nigeria really use the international connections for that intensive research that it really should be, is proper for it to be used for. And so those are two quite important sort of things to keep in mind, and important sort of kind of comparative perspectives. So now we're looking at sort of the ongoing dynamics, issues, and projections for the IXPN for Nigeria at large. One is there's been tremendous difficulty at getting buy-in from ISPs. What that effectively means is that for whatever reason, internet service providers just aren't feeling comfortable joining the IXP and cooperating with one another. What all the interviewees in the report, or many of them at the very least, have said is that Google's arrival and increased presence in sort of the internet infrastructure, which occurred in the past years, really resulted in a tangible impact in kind of the dynamics. You've seen things like InterSwitch, which is an e-transaction network, all of a sudden is sort of conducting its interactions of transactions, kind of e-transaction exchanges are now being kind of conducted with the help of the IXPN. And you're also seeing that the IXPN is adopting some solid practices, such as encouraging its members to really use usage fees for mobile customers per megabyte, or even if they aren't, specifically encouraging them, at the very least, it's sort of an expectation, or it's the norm at the very least within the internet ecosystem there, that for mobile customers they pay per MB versus per kind of a flat rate, and that sort of usage-based rate helps provide kind of a more tangible incentive for internet service providers to really provide the quality connections that customers deserve in Nigeria. And while they haven't yet become a regional hub, they've got a target for 2015 to really become a leading IXP. And so with all of that said, there's some sort of questions, which are, can improved cross-network connectivity lead to enhanced IXPN performance? It's unclear what would need to happen for sort of stronger sort of inter-ISP cooperation to occur, just like was mentioned in Kenya's case, and sort of also what can the IXPN do to draw in cautious prospective members. In terms of next steps, you see points of presence are really going to be implemented in Nigeria's each of Nigeria's sort of political regions, and really what that will do is sort of solidify the IXP and make it all of a sudden where IXPN is not just sort of a kind of a referee or sort of like a traffic referee, but rather has a toehold in so many different regions where that is sort of made even more local, not just to the country but to specific regions. So that's one impact that will be sort of coming in the future sort of years and months. Another next step is that future inter-ISP collaboration is likely to occur. And what that will do is really lead to not just more cooperation with domestic traffic, but more cooperation with international traffic. And something else is, the Nigerian government has not fully localize its data, but the IXPN can act as a catalyst for encouraging and enabling the government to do so. And lastly, you really see some exciting stories in Nigeria with the IXP that they've put into place. You see cloud-reliant industries that otherwise would not have had the quality of internet on their end or on their client's end to really be successful, all of a sudden have a real chance at flourishing. But more interestingly, you even see industries like Nollywood, which is Nigeria's Hollywood, so to speak, having countless filmmakers post their videos online of their films, and all of a sudden you have an increased quality of internet leading to increased video usage, which is kind of causing a whole sort of new transformation to an industry in the country that is not directly a technological industry. And so these are all sort of some of the issues at hand. Okay, so now we're at projections. In this part of the report, Hurpy and Kende sort of take 4 steps back and sort of look at kind of the broader projections for the future. Both, though Nigeria is not as well positioned relative to its peer group as Kenya is, both are poised to surpass their peers and eventually kind of enter a whole different category of sort of who their peer group would look like eventually. South Africa continues to sort of be a regional hub for the area. And international bandwidth connections for both countries have doubled annually since 2007. So as many issues as there may be for both internet ecosystems, the speed of progress has been so incredible. And I would note that there's a graph on the right that the authors of the report sort of include in their report, and it's a great chart. You can see there are really 3 sort of lines I want to show you. So each of these lines you see are actually submarine cables. These are sort of, each cable is carrying an international connection. Think that plane versus that highway. So those high cost but essential international sort of opportunities for connection. And the wider the cable, kind of the more horsepower, so to speak, exists in that connection. So I'm going to point out 3 different kind of connections that are particularly interesting. One being, so first off, let me also mention that to the left you have a pink star, which represents one IXP that we've discussed, a kind of yellow goldish star that represents the other. The goldish star is representing Kenya's IXP, and the pink star is representing Nigeria's IXP. So you can see some interesting things. First off, there's this big sort of green line, and you see it sort of touching South Africa. But it doesn't touch either country we've discussed. And this is a very, very high power submarine connection that kind of has skipped over both countries and is currently being sort of in the works, so to speak, of being established. So, but what you do see is that as you look at Kenya, you can see multiple connections have reached its submarine cable connections. One, for instance, is the one in red, which is the CCOM connection. You can also see for Nigeria that it has its own connections that have reached it as well, such as ACE, for instance, which is actually one that's in has been slated, at least according to this graph, to be have been completed by the third quarter of 2012. So that sort of gives a sense of where things stand. And what's really important to consider is the usage of of domestic connections impacts the broader internet ecosystem. So having a high quality IXP permits a submarine cable operator to feel comfortable investing and putting their cable in a given country, because as an IXP causes and fosters the internet in that country to grow, all of a sudden a submarine cable operator that brings in a new international connection to a country has a new interest and sees a whole new marketplace in a given country. So those are sort of some really important points to make. So now we're on the conclusion slide. And in this slide, what we really want to point out is that there are sort of there are many observed benefits of adopting sort of an IXP and a smart strategy about how to kind of balance domestic traffic and international traffic. Lower cost is one, increased quality is another, a more usable internet is yet another, and transformative changes for IXPs in the near future will accelerate their development and the development of the internet in their given countries. But the success of IXPs feed on its the success of IXPs, rather, I apologize, kind of is self-feeding. So essentially, what that means is that when an IXP sort of begins to thrive, what that does is it kind of begins to kind of bring all sorts of investment into a given country, and I can't certainly speak on behalf of Google, but certainly just kind of as a kind of personal opinion, I can certainly say that when all of a sudden when an IXP sort of is set up and leads to a thriving internet, I can imagine that sort of kind of incents caches and other kind of bits of infrastructure to sort of flow into the country. And IXPs also change how an individual might use the internet. And so individuals are all of a sudden, as we mentioned, using YouTube more or videos more or all sorts of sort of more intensive internet applications more when they realize that their internet has become of a better quality and of a lower cost once an IXP has been implemented and been able to lead to efficiency gains. But there are ongoing challenges. There's always more progress to make in localizing data. We noticed that .k is being used more in Kenya now, but in Nigeria, the government hasn't fully localized their data. So data, is always the goal, and to greater efficiency is always bringing that data closer and closer and closer to the end user. But the comprehensive localization is still, a distant goal. And the infrastructure that exists outside of an IXP is still sometimes weak. So as strong as an IXP may be itself, if the internet sort of infrastructure outside of that IXP isn't strong, it doesn't really matter how good the coordinating mechanisms are if the actual rest of the internet connection system isn't working well. And lastly, there are security costs and security issues, as well as international connectivity costs, and all of those things can still hamper internet usage in a given country. And what the authors sort of conclude by noting is that sort of there's a three-step process to kind of progress for an internet sort of ecosystem. you have to begin with cooperative policymakers who are willing to permit these bits of infrastructure to bubble up and sort of develop fairly organically. And once you have the cooperative policymakers, IXPs will follow. And in our case, there were KIXP and IXPN, but it could be, they could certainly have kind of different organizations or different structures in a different country. And what that leads to is when you have these IXPs and they're all of a sudden leading to kind of a stronger internet and a more vibrant internet given country with more localized data, what that leads to is having regional hubs of sort of the internet. And all of a sudden, as you saw in South Africa, with its IXPs, where kind of the localized data and the quality of the internet all of a sudden attracted all sorts of websites, all sorts of data, all sorts of usage towards Africa and towards Africa's internet economy. The IXPs being successful really can help a country have an advantage in becoming a regional hub for the internet at large. So with that, that's the essence of what the report is really about. The final thing I'd really like to note is that one other kind of key theme or key idea is that that this kind of really thoughtful and helpful policy framework is critical. And in terms of sort of having kind of thought leaders in these regards, you have there are two sort of industry leaders. There's Links. And there's AMSX. Links is London's internet exchange provider, and AMSX is Amsterdam's, and they're globally recognized as sort of industry leaders, and they sort of have been innovators of their kind of data center and virtual IXP configuration strategies. And so as sort of all of these kind of considerations are made and questions are contemplated, certainly though no one model sort of provides the answer for every country, those industry leaders will certainly be, according to the authors, quite important in keeping in mind. So with all of that said, thank you again for joining me and watching this presentation, and I certainly hope you, after this, have a chance to read the report as well. So thank you.